I've shot with the ZV-E1 extensively for about 4 months now since I switched to this camera from Canon. I used to have the Canon R6, wanted to switch to Sony for various reasons. I made a video about that back when I first got the camera, but then I couldn't show any footage obviously because I had just gotten it. So we've been traveling all over New Zealand for the past 4 months in our camper van, and I've done a variety of projects, mostly shooting personally, but in a lot of different environments, dark and bright. But we've also done a few corporate projects, which I unfortunately can't show you, but that has something to do with this video as well. So I'm not gonna give a full review of this camera because there's so many of those already and it's not exactly a new camera. But what I am gonna do is tell you about my experience in terms of 3 pros and 3 kind of cons that I have with this camera. But full disclaimer first, I absolutely love this camera and I am working a little bit sometimes with Sony. So if that means anything to you in terms of bias, then take it as what it is. But I'm not getting paid by Sony. They don't have any say in this video or anything like that. So yeah, do with this information what you want. I know we have to do all these disclaimers on YouTube these days, so. There are a few things that has surprised me or really been a nice add-on to switch to not necessarily Canon, but just my previous camera to the Sony ZV-E1. And the first thing I've noticed is the dynamic range. Now, first of all, the sensor is amazing. It's the same one that's in the FX3 and the FX6, and I think there are some differences in quality. I think that's come down to processing and other things, but the ZV-E1 produces a very, very nice, clean 4K image, but the dynamic range is what's really stood out to me. And the reason that that's the case is because I've actually changed up how I'm shooting now. I was always going to shoot in S-Log3 because that's the best log profile that this camera offers. But on top of that, instead of just shooting overexposed plus 1.7 or using a ZBrush to expose for the skin, what I've done instead is now I'm just using ZBrush 2 to IRE 94, which is just around when it's clipping S-Log3. And I'm just exposing up until the clipping point, which I'm doing right now as well. And the reason for that is it's so much easier to bring down in post afterwards. That's not something I try to do with my Canon, but I know that this sensor has like 15 stops of dynamic range, or at least that's advertised. It's probably not the reality, but I have definitely noticed a very big difference. Now, in terms of dynamic range, we all know that this camera has a dual native ISO at 12,800, and it's not something that I use that much, and I do find that the colors quickly fall apart in 12,800 when I'm pushing it too far. So it's much more important to nail white balance when shooting like that. But apart from that, it's so nice to have. Now, I'm not sure if 12,800 is the best option for me. I think maybe something like 4,000 or 3,200, whatever other cameras have, could maybe be a nicer mid-range because it's a very large jump. But that said, going from bright outside to very dark inside, it's so easy to just switch up to 12,800 and sometimes even keep the ND filter on. A perfect example of that was when we visited the Hobbiton movie set here in New Zealand, and I just went inside, switched to 12,800 and still got some amazing footage, which I know I couldn't have gotten on my old Canon R6 without it having been really, really noisy. So nothing against Canon or pros with Sony here. It's just that my experience with this camera has been so good in terms of dynamic range, and also the ISO has been really, really nice. The second thing is kind of twofold. It's the size and the weight. And the thing that I did expect with this, because it's an absolutely tiny camera, was that it's gonna be perfect for traveling like I am right now. And mainly because it's so small and lightweight, especially paired with a Sony lens, which is something I've really seen or noticed coming from Canon, that not only the camera is lighter and smaller, but also the lens is a lot lighter and smaller than what I've been used to. So I was originally thinking about getting the FX3, but I couldn't afford it, so I got this instead, and I'm actually really happy that I did. Now, it doesn't have the fan, which is something that we'll get to a little bit later, but it's made it so that I'm bringing the camera around a lot more than I used to. And that's just a huge benefit because often if the camera is too big, clunky, heavy, whatever, I just tend to not bring it because I don't want to carry it around. This camera, I just put the sling on, put it around my shoulder, and then I bring it around. Sometimes I don't even shoot with it, even though I bring it, but it's just so nice to have if there's something that I want to capture, or if I decide to suddenly vlog or do something like that. So that's been a huge benefit. Now, with the size and the weight, I was a little bit concerned that it didn't have as many customizable buttons, because I love to customize my camera and set everything up so it's as fast and efficient for my style of shooting as possible. And because I've been used to having a lot more buttons and dials, I was a little bit concerned with that. But having a G Master lens where I can change the aperture on actually made it so that that's not an issue at all. And something that I noticed that really surprised me is that all the buttons are on the right side of the camera, which means that I can change everything with just my right hand when I still have my left hand on the lens or on the screen or whatever. And it seems like a small thing, and at first I didn't really think about it. But the more I use the camera, the more I've been realizing that it's such a huge benefit for me that I can just change everything with my left hand. The 3 weeks that I borrowed the FX3 from Sony New Zealand, I noticed that the mode switch was something that was on the left side, and it kind of just took an extra step to move my hand there and change that around. So it seems like a small thing. It's been huge for me to have that little benefit, and it's all those small things that add up to using a camera like that. So the size and the weight has been a benefit. I know one more thing in that is whenever I use a gimbal, which is not that often, it's also been a huge benefit that it's so small and lightweight, because it's so easy to balance on the gimbal, which is something that I struggled so much with the heavy Canon lenses and the heavier camera. So this is specific to the ZV-E1, but I know that Sony in general just makes smaller cameras and smaller bodies and lighter lenses. So it is easier to fly on a gimbal if that's something that you need. So let's just recap. It's the dynamic range that I've really noticed is a nice improvement shooting in S-Log3. It's the size and weight, so I bring it around everywhere, and then it's customizability. And I know Sony used to have a bad menu setup. They were always known for that. I love the newer style menu setting that they have now. I think it's perfect. And honestly, I don't use it that much because I just set everything up. So I have either in the function menu or on the custom buttons, I can just change everything that I need. It's very rare that I have to go in to the settings and change anything from there. Then we get to one of the cons of not necessarily this camera, maybe it's just Sony, or maybe it's me. I'm actually not entirely sure, but it's the stabilization. I know a lot of people love the stabilization in Sony cameras. I know a lot of people say that Lumix is the king of stabilization, but coming from Canon, which is the only other brand that I have experience with, the IBIS in that was so wobbly that it was so annoying, especially shooting on wider lenses. You got that wobbly corners. I don't know if that happens on Sony because I don't have as wide lenses as I tried on Canon, but the Sony stabilization to me seems more jerky. So like when I'm moving or when I'm trying to pan with the stabilization turned on, it kind of like sometimes just jerks the screen a little bit. I'm gonna try and see if I can find an example to show you on screen now, but that to me kind of ruins the footage. Now it's better than having wobbles, I will say that. I like this more, but it's still annoying. And I think it might be me or the way I'm using stabilization. I never use dynamic or active. I always just use the standard stabilization because I find the other two doing it even more. And I think for some use cases, it's fine, but for what I've been needing it for, it's kind of annoying. So I think because the G Master lens that I have, the 24-70 Mark II, also doesn't have stabilization in it, that might also be a factor in that. So that's something that I'm a little bit disappointed in on the lens side and on the stabilization side. So it's kind of like a twofold con there. Like the most expensive lenses from Sony don't have stabilization, or at least in the 24-70, which I think is a little bit odd. And the stabilization in itself, I'm just not super happy with. Now I know I can go into Catalyst or whatever the program is called, because it has all the gyro data and I can try and take it around there. I haven't tried that yet and I might do it at some point, but just seems like an annoying extra step. So yeah, take it for what it is. I'm not amazingly happy with the stabilization, but I also don't hate it. It's still usable. So yeah, that's just my experience. Then we come to the elephant in the room, which is, this is not a big problem or big deal with this camera, if I'm being honest. But it depends on what you're using it for. If you want to set it up for interviews, long recording sessions, something like that, it might become a problem. But I will defend the camera here and say it's a tiny body, and even with the high temperature control thing set on, it's still a very tiny body. And if you're shooting in 4K like I always am, it's gonna get heat. And because there's no fan in it, it's just gonna be difficult for it to get rid of the heat. We shot a corporate project where we had to do 5 kind of back-to-back interviews. And after 4, or like at the end of the 4th one, this camera just shut down on me. And it was the worst possible scenario because the 5th interview was the most important, but we had like a 15-minute break between the 2. So I put it in the fridge, and afterwards we were perfectly fine shooting. These were very long recording sessions back to back in a hot room. Besides that, I've shot in 4K 120, 4K 60, 4K 30, for like a lot of footage. And also not longer recording sessions, but like just long days with filming a lot. And I have not had any other overheating issues with this camera aside from that. Now, it's not been massively hot here in New Zealand, but I just wanted to say that, like, if it's advertised as a vlogging camera, so don't try to use it for professional interview setups if you expect it to not overheat. I know you can get those small fans that you can attach to it. I think it looks ugly. I think it's annoying that I have to get that to not make it overheat. And that might not be the case in reality, but I haven't gotten one of those that might just completely fix the issue. I've heard other people say that. So it's not that there's no solutions for this if you want to use this camera for that, but it's just something that I noticed. And I'm gonna move more into corporate shooting next year. So for me, it makes it a little bit more difficult to use this camera for that. But as a travel camera, I think this is amazing. But that also leads us to my next point, which is also a con, or the last con, essentially. So this camera is perfectly capable of taking raw photos, and I think they look very good. But of course, this camera, or the sensor, only has 12 megapixels. So you're not gonna get high resolution photos, which is fine for me. Like, we've been taking some very, very nice photos. We just used it for a hotel collaboration the other week, and I'm so happy with how the photos turned out, and they are more than easy to edit. Like, the raw footage or the raw photos from this camera, I think they're great. Of course, you're lacking the resolution, but I think the pro is that you can use it for photos, and the con is that it only has 12 megapixels. I never intended to use this for photography, but I'm slowly finding myself back a little bit to photography in some instances, so it would be nice with more megapixels. But don't buy this camera for photography specifically. Buy it if you're video first, you do mainly video like I do, and sometimes you need photography, then this is perfectly fine if it's just photos for social media. I think that's a con if you're a hybrid shooter, but I don't think this is necessarily a hybrid camera. This is a video camera. So I want to end off this video with saying, I think if you're watching this video and you're considering this camera, you're maybe buying your first camera and you have the budget to buy something like this, because let's be honest, it's not a cheap camera, but it's also not the most expensive camera. Like, compared to, I don't know what the FX30 costs, but that's a crop sensor, which I wasn't after. I wanted the full frame sensor. Compared to the FX3 and the FX6, for example, they are way more expensive. And if you are going to use it as a travel camera, a content creation camera, like an everyday camera, but just filming and maybe taking some photos, I think this is an amazing camera, and I am so happy with it, especially because of the quality that it produces overall. So the second thing for that is that, as I said, if you are in the market for a new camera or you're looking to upgrade, I think this camera is, especially for beginners, a camera that you can grow a lot with. Now, I've been shooting video professionally for 2 years now, and photos even longer, but this camera is something you can grow with because it's targeted as like a content creation vlogging camera. It has so many beginner features that I haven't even touched, like cinematic mode and skin retouch and all other kind of features. But it's just a very easy camera to use as well. Now again, I probably wouldn't use it for interviews specifically unless it's like short sessions, so just like one interview of 20 minutes, you can definitely do that. But if you have to use it for brand work or smaller shoots or just content creation for companies, I think this is more than capable for that. And if you shoot in difficult situations where you need 12,800 ISO, you also have that. So again, it's not a review, this is just my honest thoughts on this camera, and I was very scared that I was not gonna like it, but there's been so many pros with the size, with the weight, with the image quality, the dynamic range, all of those things combined, that I think it's such a great video camera. I think you get so much packed into this camera. The cameras that we have in this day and age and new cameras coming out have such amazing quality. So find the camera that has 4K 60 video and the megapixel count that you need if you need to take photos, and then buy that. And it's probably gonna be more than capable of taking you far into the future. So the ZV-E1, yeah, amazing camera. And if I'm gonna end up with fanboying a little bit about Sony as the very last point, Sony has the largest lens collection or lens mount that you can buy, both from Sony themselves on the E-mount, but also just from third party. So if you're new to cameras, trying to find your first camera and you've been thinking about this, that's why you're watching this video, I think Sony is the best choice in 2024 and 2025. And I love that Sony are doing so much for their community. I've been able to work with them a little bit already. I'm gonna work hopefully more with them when I return to Europe next year. But I really can feel that they care about their creators, they care about their customers, and as much as they get hate from putting out new cameras all the time, that's a pro. That's something that people ask for from other manufacturers that don't put out cameras as often. So you'll never find the balance, but choose the camera that works for you. If you're video first, if you're serious about video, this is a great camera. It also does photos. So that's that. I love this camera. I'm very, very happy with my purchase, and it's been perfect for bringing around on a trip like this or travel in general. So I'm definitely going to keep this camera in the future for just taking with me if I need to shoot video or do something. I'm way more likely to bring this with me than any other camera I've owned in the past. So with that said, if you have any questions that I haven't covered in this or you're curious about, then I think I have a good amount of experience with the camera now. So leave your comment below and I'm happy to help and answer. And other than that, I hope to post a lot more videos in the future. Moving forward, I've had a little bit of a break, a little bit of a struggle. I'll talk about that later. But yeah, until the next time, take care.